My ex-husband hid our assets in shell companies, but I uncovered it. Now he must repay every penny. My name's Casey. I'm 34. And let's just say my divorce wasn't a fairy tale where everyone calmly divides the forks. No, it was more of a soap opera starring my ex, Rick, the guy who once promised me forever. He was 5 years older, polished, the perfect husband on the outside but a mess beneath. Turns out, not everything that glitters is gold. In Rick's case, it was fake assets haphazardly thrown together. We were married almost 10 years, had a house, a child, what I thought was a shared life. But Rick apparently needed someone else in his perfect world. I took his happy life too literally. He saw it differently. The divorce? Just the beginning of my nightmare. Time passed, and I started noticing money disappearing from our bank accounts. Not small sums either. Imagine sitting there, scrolling through statements, realizing our nest egg had vanished. It felt like some fraud movie, except this was my life. So I became a detective, hunting down every document, scanning our so-called family records. And then I hit the jackpot. Strange transfers to accounts under names I didn't know. Who the hell is Charlie Williams? Have I ever met Susan Lewis? This was no game, but if it were, I'd have won a medal for persistence. Every instinct said to confront Rick immediately, but something told me to be cautious. As I stared at yet another unfamiliar name in the statements, one thought settled. Rick, you're way in over your head. When I noticed my bank account was emptier than Rick's brains, I knew I needed backup. But charging in headfirst wasn't an option. As much as I wanted to confront him, he'd probably covered all his tracks. So, I had to play it smart. Quiet, careful, and very patient. My first step was calling the bank. Easier said than done, though. Customer service was like a bad joke where I couldn't know anything about my own money. Sorry, that information is confidential. Ma'am, we can't provide that information. I knew those reps by heart. I'd called them so many times, only to hit dead ends labeled, "You're not getting anywhere." Finally, I turned to an old friend, Sam. Not just any private investigator. Sam's a pro at uncovering secrets buried miles deep. He's the guy who'll read a 10 ways to find your husband's hidden accounts article and laugh, saying, "I can do that in 5 minutes." For him, this was practically a sport. We met at a cafe where he was a regular. His coffee was ready before we even sat. I laid out the story, and Sam, in his usual casual way, said, "So, Rick's hiding money? Cute. Let's see how deep he's buried his gold mine." That's exactly what I needed. Someone who'd dive into the filthiest parts without hesitation. Sam suggested talking to Rick's former colleagues. "Colleagues always know more than they should," he said. "Just ask the right questions." So he invited a few for friendly chats, and soon we uncovered Rick's little empire, a web of shell companies funneling money like a shadowy fortune. With each new piece, the picture became clearer. Our perfect marriage was as fake as Rick's companies. I'd been nothing but a cover for his schemes, just another asset. And with every revelation, my last trace of naivety about him melted away. Sam didn't waste any time. A few days later, he calls me, his voice practically shaking with excitement. "You won't believe what I found." We met at his office, and without even a greeting, he dropped a pile of documents on the table. "Take a look, Casey," he said, pointing at one of the pages. "All these accounts, they're fake. The companies your ex set up don't exist. They're pure shell companies he created to stash their money." I look at the names of these firms, and it nearly makes me sick. Rick? Set up a network of fake companies? Just to drain money from our family's finances? I felt like I was in some cheap thriller. And the amounts in those accounts, by the way, could have bought me an entire designer shoe army, each pair in a different style and color. But no, That money was hiding in someone else's pocket while I pinched pennies. Just fantastic. So you're telling me, I say, still trying to wrap my head around the scale of the disaster, that he was essentially running this financial circus right under my nose? Sam nodded with a wry smile. Looks like it. The guy was good. But every scheme eventually sees the light. I can't process it. I remember once walking into Rick's office to find our savings documents, only to come across some papers with strange names and odd figures that looked like a financial contribution to some account. At the time, I thought, hey, these are just his work matters. And I left it alone. But now, thinking back on it, I realized that I might have been staring right at the proof of his double life, while he stood there with an innocent smile, like it wasn't one of his little tricks. Sam, watching my dazed look, leaned in closer and said, "You have to understand, Casey. Your perfect Rick is just a well-rehearsed act. This guy knows how to put on a mask. And I don't think he has any idea how close you are to exposing him." I was horrified, but a new picture of my life was starting to take shape in my mind. My whole life had been one big illusion. For 10 years, he'd been pretending to be the ideal husband, while behind the scenes, he was building his own private fortune. Inside, I was boiling over. And no, this wasn't just anger. It was rage, the kind that doesn't let go until you found justice. Every time I thought of how my perfect husband Rick had spent years putting on a show and hiding our money in shell companies, it made me feel like a coiled spring about to snap. I was on the edge, but stopping? Nope, that wasn't an option. My rage became my fuel, and honestly, it was the best thing I'd felt in years. When Sam said this was more serious than just a secret stash, I realized intuition alone wouldn't cut it. I was going to need a financial expert, and not some boring accountant with spreadsheets, but a true professional in financial schemes. Someone who worked at big banks and knew how to track money when it was trying to hide. So there I was, standing in his office, across from a man in a perfectly pressed suit with a face that looked straight out of a detective movie. He looked over all the papers I'd brought, and I swear, his eyes widened. "Well, miss, let me tell you one thing. Your husband seems to be a bit of a thrill seeker. It's like he's treating money like his personal carnival ride. You've got more here than just tax evasion. You've got real financial acrobatics." Naturally, I tried to figure out what that meant for me. He told me, "Rick set up shell companies and used each one to siphon off funds from your budget. It's like he took your hand, promised he'd be right back with lunch, and then disappeared for 2 years, leaving you broke." Incredible, right? I sat there across from him, trying to understand how this could have happened right under my nose. And the expert confirmed my worst fears. Rick had been squeezing money out of our business like someone wringing the last drops from a lemon. Every account, every amount. It all went to these fake companies I hadn't known existed. Incredible, Rick. Truly. It's like we weren't a family, but some kind of banking project he successfully wrapped up for his own benefit. The stakes were rising. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a real fight. And most importantly, I knew that real court awaited me, and this was no joke. Rick would do everything to get away with it. And me? I was going to fight to the last breath because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was my life, my reputation. And if he thought he could walk away from this, he clearly didn't know me well. Well, it was time to give dear Rick a personal hello from hell. Enough hiding behind detectives and financial experts. I needed to hear everything directly from him, looking him in the eyes. And most importantly, I needed to understand what was going on in his mind. If he had a shred of conscience, he'd at least try to apologize, even pretend. I decided to meet him at our old cafe, where we'd once been a happy family. How touching, right? Only now it felt like I was going to war. I got there first, of course. As I waited, I looked around. It felt strange to be sitting there alone. The same wooden tables, people with their coffees, the cozy atmosphere. But inside me, there was fire. And then he showed up, confident, in his perfectly pressed suit, looking like he'd come not to explain himself, but for a corporate magazine photo shoot. Everything inside me boiled, but I held it together. I thought, there he is, the great businessman, coming down from his pedestal to chat with a mere mortal. He sat across from me, not even bothering to start the conversation. Just stared at me with a smirk, as if I were there for his entertainment. I took a deep breath and began. You know, Rick, I thought you'd at least try to explain yourself. I just want to understand how someone I trusted could sink so low. Say something, anything, other than your usual, it's just business. And then his smug grin widened. You'll never understand, Casey. He said like he was telling some kind of joke. Businessmen don't always play by the rules. Lovely, right? He said it like I was complaining about an extra service fee in a restaurant, not the fact that he'd made off with all our money. And then he drove the final nail in the coffin of this friendly conversation. And you have only yourself to blame for your suffering. He looked me straight in the eye and made it clear. He wasn't planning to give back a cent. There he was, my ex, playing the role of a cynical businessman who had everything under control. I was stunned. Somewhere inside, I'd hoped he'd at least pretend to be sorry. But no. He sat there with that disgusting smug smile, and all I wanted was to knock him down from the pedestal he'd obviously been sitting on for far too long. Now looking at him, I understood one thing. I didn't just want my money back. I wanted him to feel the same pain and helplessness he'd put me through. So I decided to go all the way. If this smooth-talking businessman thought I'd just swallow my pride and disappear, he was dead wrong. Now I was determined, and I needed a top-notch lawyer, someone who'd know how to actually get the money back. Crazy rage? Absolutely. And here's where Carla stepped in, a friend who'd always had my back, even though she's known for finding herself in the wildest situations. She quickly jumped in on Operation Casey versus Rick and didn't hesitate to advise, take him to court and make it hurt like a toothache, long, painful, and without anesthesia. Carla and I immediately started gathering evidence. What else? If my ex knew how to steal big, I had to make an equally big move. I found every document I could, dug up every detail I'd once considered work papers, and threw all of it at our lawyer like a grenade. And this lawyer? Oh, he was my dream come true in this moment of my life. Serious, focused, stone-faced. He could probably scare the devil himself. But here's the thing. Rick isn't an idiot either. He hired his own guru, a lawyer with a reputation for being a true financial monster, willing to use anything, from threats to manipulation, to win. Rumor has it he can flip any case and would happily be on anyone's list of people to avoid if they had an ounce of common sense. The wild court process began. It was honestly like stepping into the ring, where each day in court felt like a gladiatorial fight. Rick's lawyer would throw out some clever trick, and my lawyer would counter in ways that filled the air with the scent of adrenaline. I sat there in the courtroom, squeezing into my seat, watching Rick and his team do everything they could to break me down. His lawyer was a master of mind games, and he was determined to convince everyone that I was somehow to blame for my own suffering. Hilarious? Absolutely. But I wasn't laughing. Every day was a survival marathon. At first, I thought my nerves would give out, that I wouldn't survive this madness. But then I'd remember Rick's smirk at the cafe, and I'd realize there was no turning back. This wasn't just about money, it was about justice. The day of the hearing finally arrived, and Rick was practically glowing. He sat there in his perfectly tailored suit, alongside his lawyer, who looked ready to tear apart anyone who dared raise their voice against their dream team. They seemed so sure of themselves, like they were at some awards ceremony, not in a courtroom. Rick, of course, thought himself untouchable, and he looked at me like I was just a bothersome detail in his meticulously constructed life. Honestly, I wanted to ask, "Hey, aren't you tired of this yet?" I stood up with my evidence, and the room fell so silent that you could hear a pin drop. I laid the dossier Sam and I had compiled before the judge. All of it. A dynamite combo like a perfectly timed firework. I flipped through the pages, explaining each transaction, each account, each suspicious company that Rick had so diligently tried to hide. The judge watched and listened, and with every word, his face grew colder. I could have sworn that at one point, he raised an eyebrow and glanced at Rick like he was some stain who'd walked onto the wrong set. Rick and his lawyer tried to take control, to confuse the judge with their slick arguments. Their plan? Pretend it was all just a series of coincidences, some minor mistakes, that there was nothing suspicious about him having more shell companies than a known mobster. Your Honor, it's just a misunderstanding. That's what came from Rick's side. But believe me, when your evidence speaks for itself, there's not much else a lawyer can do. The judge glanced over the documents again, then slowly turned to Rick with a look that would make even the most confident lose their footing. I could see my ex's face grow pale, see him shrink under the weight of the facts he could no longer deny. The panic in his eyes. Now that was a show. He was realizing that this wasn't going his way at all. The courtroom was tense as could be. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see where this was headed. Rick glanced at me, his eyes filled with anger and disbelief, as if I'd brought something personal into the mix. And you know what? I absolutely had. Finally, the day of the verdict came, and I was practically choking on nerves. Never before did I imagine that the feeling of justice could be so intense. My heart was pounding like I was in the last seconds of a championship game, and my final shot would decide everything. Rick sat across from me, wearing his usual mask of confidence and self-satisfaction. But trust me, I didn't have to be a genius to see how genuinely nervous he was. All he was missing was a panic sign. The judge entered, and all eyes were on him. The atmosphere in the room felt like the eye of a storm. Every glance, every movement sharpened to the max. And then the judge spoke the words I'd been ready to fight for till my last breath. Rick is required to return all funds he withdrew from the shared assets and pay a fine for fraud. Yes, exactly. It was happening. I won. First, I watched his face shift from his usual smug mask to a pale, lost expression. His smile vanished, and his arrogance drained away like air from a punctured balloon. He realized this wasn't his show anymore. His little theater had collapsed, and he was at the heart of the wreckage. Rick was defeated, and he had no choice but to submit to the verdict. It was like a massive weight had lifted off my chest. I felt truly free, as if there were no more shadows, no hidden dark corners in my life. The seconds in that courtroom stretched out endlessly, but I savored every one of them. Finally, I didn't have to hold on to all that anger and pain. Leaving the room, I realized that my life was now truly mine. I was free of his lies, his pathetic games, every fake document he'd hidden behind my back. Of course, this story would stay with me forever. A searing reminder of just how low people we once loved can sink. But now, it's also a reminder of how strong I became to face it all. So yeah, dear Rick, thanks for the lesson.